What survives when knowledge disappears? Not the noise of conquest, not the names of kings, not even the certainty of the stories we tell ourselves. Sometimes what remains is smaller than memory should allow. A corroded gear in a block of bronze, a staircase descending into dark stone, a symbol carved into a pillar before writing had a name. History is full of these fragments, quiet objects that seem to look back at us and ask whether we have misunderstood the past. We like to imagine civilization as a steady ascent, each century handing its tools to the next. But the Earth does not keep time so neatly. It buries, it erodes, it floods coastlines and seals chambers with dust. And every so often, it returns something that does not fit the timeline we built. An instrument too precise, a monument too early, a craft too refined for the age that produced it. Not proof of fantasy, but evidence of how partial our confidence can be. Across oceans and deserts, from Mediterranean shipwrecks to Turkish hilltops, from the Andes to the caves of Siberia, there are artifacts that resist easy explanation. Scholars study them carefully and often wisely. Engineers measure them. Archaeologists place them in context. Many can be understood, at least in part, through patience and method. Yet even the most grounded explanation leaves a faint remainder, a residue of wonder. How much did ancient people know? How much was learned, lost, and learned again? This is not a story about secret powers or hidden empires waiting beneath the surface. It is a story about human beings confronting the unknown, then and now, about the fragile chain between memory and forgetting, about the possibility that progress is less like a road and more like a tide, advancing, receding, leaving strange treasures on the shore. So we begin where many mysteries begin, with a single discovery, lifted from silence, asking more than it answers. What if the ancient world once built a machine that could predict the sky? In 1901, sponge divers searching the cold waters off a Greek island surfaced with statues, coins, and fragments of a shipwreck that had slept on the seafloor for nearly 2,000 years. Among the treasures was an object so unremarkable at first glance that it might easily have been discarded. A lump of corroded bronze and wood, cracked open by time. But inside, it were gears. The device, now known as the Antikythera Mechanism, seemed to belong to another age entirely. Its teeth were cut with astonishing precision. Its dials mapped cycles of the sun, the moon, and perhaps even the wandering motions of the planets. Turn a handle, and the cosmos could be modeled in miniature. Not perfectly, not magically, but with a depth of mechanical reasoning that no one expected from the ancient Mediterranean world. For historians, the shock was not that Greek thinkers understood astronomy. We have long known they studied the heavens with rigor and imagination. The deeper surprise was that someone had translated that knowledge into machinery so intricate that it would not look fully at home until many centuries later. It changed the question from what the ancients believed to what they were capable of building with their hands. And yet the mechanism is also a reminder of fragility. If this one device survived by accident, how many others vanished in fire, looting, saltwater, or neglect? Was it a masterpiece without descendants, or the last witness of a broader tradition now lost to history? We cannot say with certainty. A machine meant to track repeating cycles now teaches a different lesson. Human knowledge does not always move forward in a straight line. Sometimes it flickers, disappears, and returns in fragments, asking whether invention is ever truly gone or only waiting to be found again. How far back does memory really go? On a windswept ridge in southeastern Turkey, long before cities rose in stone or writing pressed human thought into clay, people gathered around towering pillars, carved with animals, abstract signs, and forms that still feel half-dreamed. The place is called Göbekli Tepe, and standing there today, one does not first think of archaeology. One thinks of time itself, folding inward. For much of modern history, we told a simple story about civilization. First came farming, then permanent settlements, then religion, architecture, and social complexity. But Göbekli Tepe unsettled that sequence. Here were monumental structures built by communities who may not yet have lived in the fully settled agricultural world we once assumed had to come first. The old order of things, so tidy in textbooks, suddenly looked less like certainty and more like a draft. What moved people to raise such stones? Perhaps ritual, perhaps memory, perhaps a shared need to gather beneath symbols larger than any one life. The carvings do not speak in sentences we can read, yet they still communicate something unmistakably human. Attention, pattern, reverence, fear. Foxes, birds, serpents, wild boars. The natural world is not a backdrop here. It is part of the language. The mystery is not simply how the site was built, though that question remains remarkable. It is why such effort emerged so early, and what that tells us about the first great organizing force in human life. Maybe people did not settle down only to grow food. Maybe they first gathered to create meaning and built the village around the sacred. If that is true, then civilization did not begin with bread alone. It may have begun with a circle, a story, a shared silence before carved stone. And that possibility invites a humbling thought. Before we learn to master the earth, we may have first needed a place to stand together beneath the unknown. What do we make of a city built in the clouds, then left behind? High in the Andes, where mist wraps the mountain ridges and sunlight moves slowly across stone, Machu Picchu appears less like a ruin than a thought held in place. Terraces descend the slopes with quiet elegance. Temples align with peaks and sky. Water still runs where human hands once taught it how to fall. Even now, it feels intentional in a way that resists easy summary. The mystery is not that the Inca could build with brilliance. Their engineering, agriculture, and administrative skill were extraordinary. The deeper question is why this place was created in such a dramatic setting, and why it was abandoned after such a brief life. Was it a royal estate, a ceremonial retreat, a sacred observatory, or some combination of all three? The stones suggest order. The silence leaves room for interpretation. There is something moving in the precision of the site. Massive blocks meet without mortar, fitted so carefully that centuries of rain and seismic unrest have not easily pulled them apart. Windows catch the sun at meaningful moments. Paths connect residence, ritual, and cultivation as if daily life and cosmic attention were never truly separate. Machu Picchu was not simply built on the mountain, it was composed with it, and yet even a place this beautiful could slip from continuity. Empires weaken, diseases arrive, political worlds shift. What one generation raises in confidence, another may leave to grass and weather. The city endured, but its full story thinned into absence. Perhaps that is why Machu Picchu feels so intimate to modern eyes. It reminds us that greatness is not the same as permanence. A civilization can understand stone, water, astronomy, and governance, and still not guarantee that its purpose will remain legible. Sometimes the most enduring monuments do not explain themselves. They wait, asking whether beauty alone can carry memory across time. What if An entire civilization could speak to us, and we still could not understand a single complete sentence. Along the coasts and palaces of Bronze Age Crete, the Minoans left behind frescoes alive with color, vessels shaped by skilled hands, and tablets pressed with signs we can still see but not fully read. The script is called Linear A, and for all its surviving marks, it remains one of history's most eloquent silences. There is a particular frustration in an undeciphered script. It looks so close to meaning. Repeated symbols suggest structure. Certain patterns hint at trade, offerings, administration, perhaps ritual. Scholars have compared it to later writing systems, mapped its frequencies, and traced its appearance across sites linked to Minoan life. But language is more than signs. Without a secure key, the tablets remain doors half-opened, revealing form without voice. And yet the mystery is not only linguistic, it is also human. The Minoans were seafarers, builders, artists, and organizers of complex palace economies. Their world seems to have valued movement, exchange, and image as much as control. Bulls leap across plaster walls, processions unfold in elegant motion. Women and men appear not as shadows at the edges of history, but as participants in a rich cultural theater. Linear A belonged to that world. To lose its meaning is to lose not just information, but texture. When a script falls silent, what disappears with it? Laws, inventories, prayers, names of the ordinary dead, instructions for living, fragments of humor, the rhythm of a spoken tongue. A whole way of noticing reality can vanish even while its artifacts remain intact in museums and glass cases. So Linear A endures as both evidence and absence. It proves that people were here, thinking in patterns we can see. But it also reminds us that preservation is not the same as understanding. A civilization can leave behind stone, pigment, and symbols, and still keep its inner music to itself. Perhaps the deepest mystery is not that the past is gone, but that so much of it is still visible, waiting at the edge of comprehension. How does a desert remember water? In the dry plain of southern Peru, where the ground cracks beneath a relentless sun, ancient channels spiral into the earth like fingerprints left by a vanished hand. These are the Nazca Lines, an underground hydraulic system that still stirs debate. From above, their circular openings seem almost symbolic, as if they were designed not only to function, but to be seen, to announce a hidden relationship between engineering and landscape. The Nazca people are often remembered for the vast lines and figures etched across the desert floor, shapes so large they only fully reveal themselves from the sky. But the Puquios point to a different kind of intelligence. They suggest patience, observation, and a deep reading of terrain. In a place where survival depended on mastering scarcity, someone learned how to tap groundwater, guide it through subterranean canals, and keep settlements alive against the odds. What remains uncertain is exactly when these systems were built, how much of what survives belongs to the Nazca themselves, and how such knowledge was organized and transmitted. Desert technologies are rarely dramatic at first glance. They do not glitter like gold or tower like monuments. Yet they may reveal something more intimate about a civilization, how it cared for continuity, how it turned hardship into design. There is quiet beauty in that thought. Beneath one of the driest regions on Earth, water moved in darkness while life continued above. Fields could grow, communities could endure, ritual and daily labor could share the same hidden foundation. The Puquios remind us that ingenuity is often less about spectacle than about listening closely to a difficult world. Perhaps that is why they remain so compelling. They ask us to widen our idea of mystery. Not every wonder is a puzzle because it is impossible. Some are mysterious because they reflect a kind of attention we have become slow to recognize. To understand the past, we may need to look not only at what ancient people built, but at what they learned to hear beneath the silence of the land. What if the oldest map of the heavens was not written in ink, but carved in mammoth ivory? Deep in a cave in Germany, archaeologists uncovered a small object from the Ice Age, delicate enough to fit in two hands, yet vast in implication. Known as the Venus of Hohler-Fels, and other nearby artifacts from the same prehistoric world have already changed how we imagine early symbolic life. But among the most haunting discoveries is a piece of carved ivory marked with patterns that some researchers believe may reflect an ancient awareness of the stars. The claim is careful, and it should be. Prehistory rarely gives us certainty. A set of incisions can be practical, decorative, ritual, or mnemonic all at once. Yet that uncertainty is precisely what makes the object so powerful. If these markings do echo constellations or celestial cycles, they suggest that even in an age of cold landscapes and fragile survival, people were not only hunting and sheltering, they were also looking upward, measuring recurrence, noticing order in the dark. To imagine that scene is to feel the distance between us narrow. Firelight flickers at the cave mouth. Winter presses against the world beyond. Above, the sky turns with exactness no empire can command. Somewhere in that long-vanished night, a human hand traces pattern into ivory, trying to hold on to something that returns when everything else changes. Whether the carving is a star map in the strict sense may remain unresolved, but the deeper truth may not depend on a final verdict. The object belongs to a growing body of evidence that prehistoric people thought symbolically, remembered collectively, and engaged with more than immediate survival. Their lives contained wonder as well as necessity. And that raises a quiet question. When did humanity first begin to read meaning into the sky? Perhaps the better question is whether we ever stopped. Across thousands of years, under different names and different fears, we have kept searching the stars for orientation, story, and a sense that our brief lives belong to a larger pattern. What are the Nazca Lines, if not a conversation between earth and sky? Across the Peruvian desert, where almost nothing grows and the wind speaks in dust, immense figures stretch over the plain with startling calm. A hummingbird opens its wings. A spider extends its legs in perfect balance. Long geometric lines run toward the horizon, as if following instructions only the landscape remembers. From the ground, they are fragments. From above, they become intention. For decades, people have tried to explain them in a single stroke. Astronomical calendar, ritual pathways, messages to the gods, markers of water, pilgrimage, or communal identity. Each theory reveals something, yet none seems to close the case entirely. That may be because the lines were never meant to serve just one purpose. Human meaning is rarely so tidy. Sacred things often gather many functions at once. Practical, ceremonial, social, emotional. What feels undeniable is the discipline they required. These designs were made without modern flight, drawn by people who understood proportion, repetition, and the patience of collective effort. In a place so stark, the act itself becomes part of the mystery. Why devote labor to shapes most fully seen from a perspective no one could naturally occupy? Unless the point was never visual mastery alone, but participation. Walking the lines. tracing them, making ceremony out of distance and direction. There is something deeply moving in that possibility. The Nazca may have transformed the desert into a kind of text, one written not for possession but for relationship, between community and cosmos, between thirst and hope, between the visible world and the forces that seemed to guide it. Today the lines endure because the land has been mercifully dry, but endurance is not the same as certainty. They remain before us like an unanswered letter, and perhaps that is why they continue to matter. They remind us that some of humanity's most lasting creations were not built to explain the world, but to stand inside its mystery. Why do some stones seem to carry more than their own weight? In the heart of Lebanon stands Baalbek, a place where columns rise like a forest of carved light, and the foundations beneath them seem almost impossible to accept. Here, within the massive platform of an ancient temple complex, lie stones so enormous that even modern visitors struggle to understand how they were quarried, moved, and placed with the tools of the time. The sight does not merely impress. It unsettles scale itself. The Romans built grandly, and Baalbek bears their signature in many visible ways. Symmetry, monumentality, ambition turned into architecture. But beneath and around that legacy are deeper questions. Some of the largest blocks, including those still resting in the nearby quarry, suggest an engineering confidence that borders on the sublime. Not supernatural, not beyond human capacity, but so demanding in labor, planning, and coordination that it forces us to reconsider what organized societies can do when belief and power move in the same direction. There is a temptation, when faced with such magnitude, to reach for extravagant explanations. Yet the truer wonder may lie elsewhere. Ancient builders did not need impossible powers. They needed knowledge, patience, resources, and a social world willing to gather human effort into a single act of creation. That kind of collective will can be harder for us to imagine than fantasy, because it asks us to see the past not as primitive, but as disciplined in ways we no longer fully grasp. Baalbek also raises a gentler mystery. What compels a civilization to build at this scale? Or, certainly, political symbolism, almost surely. Devotion, too. Large stones do more than hold up walls. They declare permanence against the frailty of individual lives. They promise that what a people worships or fears or hopes for deserves to be anchored in earth itself. And yet even the heaviest stone cannot keep meaning fixed forever. Empires pass, rituals fade, names change. The blocks remain, but their certainty does not. Perhaps that is the final lesson of Baalbek. Human beings have always tried to make the eternal visible, and in doing so revealed both the reach of our imagination and the limits of our staying power. Could the ancient world have stumbled upon a form of power we barely expected to find there? In a museum case, the so-called Baghdad Battery looks modest enough. A clay jar, a copper cylinder, an iron rod. Nothing about it announces revelation. And yet for decades, this small object has stirred a question far larger than itself. Was it simply a storage vessel? Or did someone in antiquity understand that certain materials, brought together in the right way, could produce an electrical charge? The theory is seductive because it speaks to a modern instinct. We want the past to surprise us with versions of ourselves. If the jar functioned as a primitive battery, it might have been used for electroplating, ritual practice, or experimentation whose meaning is now lost. The possibility feels almost cinematic, a faint current running through an ancient workshop, a hidden spark where we expected only oil lamps and bronze tools. But mystery demands restraint as much as wonder. Many archaeologists remain unconvinced, and rightly so. An object can resemble a technology without serving the purpose we imagine for it. Ancient artifacts often arrive incomplete, severed from the precise contexts that would explain them. What survives is the shape. What disappears is use, intention, and the surrounding habits of life that would make the answer clear. Still, the Baghdad Battery endures because it reveals something important about how we look at history. We are not only studying old materials, we are testing the boundaries of our assumptions. What counts as innovation? How often have useful discoveries appeared in one age, then vanished before they could become systems, industries, or traditions? Knowledge does not always fail because it is false. Sometimes it fades because the world around it is not ready to keep it alive. In that sense, the little jar becomes more than a puzzle. It becomes a mirror. It reminds us that invention is fragile, context-bound, and often anonymous. A spark may occur in any century. The harder question is whether anyone is there to protect the flame. What if the greatest mystery is not what vanished, but what was carefully hidden? Beneath the limestone plateau of Giza, the great Sphinx gazes outward with an expression that has outlived dynasties, invasions, and entire cosmologies. Its face is familiar across the world, yet its origins remain strangely unsettled. We know it belongs to the ancient Egyptian landscape of monument and ritual. We know it was carved with enormous labor and symbolic intent. But questions persist around its age, its purpose, and the meanings later generations attached to it as memory accumulated around stone. Some see the Sphinx as a royal guardian, a monument to divine kingship and solar order. Others have proposed earlier dates or forgotten chambers, reading erosion patterns and buried features as evidence that the accepted timeline is incomplete. Many of these claims remain disputed, and they should be approached with care. But the reason they endure is revealing. The Sphinx seems to invite speculation because it already feels like an answer to a question we no longer remember asking. There is a special kind of silence in monuments that survive beyond the culture that first animated them. The body remains. The rituals fade. Sand rises and falls. Restorers intervene. Empires reinterpret what came before. Over time, the monument becomes layered, not only with age, but with imagination. The Sphinx is not mysterious because no one has studied it. It is mysterious because study itself keeps unfolding new uncertainties, while the monument continues to resist being reduced to a single explanation. Perhaps that resistance is part of its power. A face carved in stone can appear permanent, but meaning never is. Every generation looks again and sees its own concerns reflected there: authority, memory, weather, loss, hidden knowledge, human ambition measured against deep time. So the Sphinx remains where desert and civilization meet, neither fully explained nor fully unknown. And maybe that is enough. Some mysteries do not ask to be solved completely. They ask us to notice how much of history is built not only from answers, but from the long endurance of questions. What disappears first when a world collapses? Its buildings or its certainty? Along the Yucatan Peninsula and across the forests of Central America, the cities of the Maya still rise from the earth with astonishing grace. Pyramids step toward the sky. Observatories frame the movement of planets. Stelae record rulers, victories, rituals, and time itself, with a confidence that feels almost architectural. And yet one of history's most sophisticated civilizations entered a long unraveling that remains, even now, difficult to explain in full. For generations, people searched for a single cause: drought, warfare, political fragmentation, ecological strain, social upheaval. Each offers part of the picture. None seems sufficient alone. That is often the way with human decline. Civilizations rarely fall like a wall in one dramatic moment. They fray. Systems that once supported meaning and order begin to fail each other. Food becomes uncertain. Alliances weaken. Trust narrows. What looked permanent reveals its dependence on countless fragile relationships. The Maya knew the sky with remarkable precision. They tracked cycles of Venus, shaped calendars of extraordinary complexity, and embedded cosmic order into daily and ceremonial life. But knowledge does not exempt a people from vulnerability. In some ways, it makes their story more affecting. A civilization can understand time deeply and still be overtaken by circumstances unfolding within it. Wisdom is not the same as immunity, and yet the Maya did not vanish. This matters. Their descendants live on, carrying language, memory, and cultural continuity into the present. What changed was not the existence of a people, but the form of a political and urban world. Ruins can tempt us into narratives of disappearance. The fuller truth is more human. Lives continue. Meaning adapts. History sheds structures, but not always identity. Perhaps that is why the Maya remains so powerful in our imagination. Their story is not simply about collapse. It is about transformation under pressure and about how even the most brilliant systems can lose balance. The lesson is not despair. It is humility. We build calendars, cities, institutions, and stories to steady ourselves against uncertainty. But in the end, survival may belong less to what we construct than to what we are able to carry forward when the construction begins to break. What if the oldest stories of disaster are not exaggerations, but memory softened into myth? Across continents and centuries, human cultures have told of great floods, swallowed lands, and waters that rose fast enough to rearrange the meaning of a lifetime. These accounts differ in detail, voice, and theology, yet they share a haunting structure. Something stable gives way. The familiar world disappears. A few endure. Memory survives by becoming narrative. Modern science does not read these stories as simple records, nor should it. Myth is not journalism. It compresses fear, morality, landscape, and communal trauma into forms the heart can carry. And yet geology has shown that ancient people did live through dramatic environmental change. Coastlines shifted, ice melted, seas advanced, rivers broke their bounds. In some places, the land itself remembered catastrophe long after precise dates were forgotten. It is possible that certain legends preserve echoes of real events, transformed over generations into sacred language. That possibility matters because it changes how we think about knowledge. Not all truth is kept in archives or equations. Some of it travels through metaphor, chant, and story told beside a fire. What looks unscientific at first glance may still contain a form of observation, one shaped not for measurement, but for survival. A warning, repeated in symbolic language, can outlast empires. There is tenderness in that idea. Imagine a community trying to preserve what cannot be fully explained to children not yet born. The water came. The world changed. Remember this. Remember where not to build. Remember that certainty can vanish in a season. Over time, the practical and the spiritual merge. The flood becomes both event and lesson, history and mirror. Perhaps that is why these stories still reach us. They remind us that human beings have always lived at the edge of forces larger than themselves. We answer that vulnerability with maps, levees, science, prayer, and art. But we also answer it with memory. And sometimes memory, speaking in the language of myth, tells us not just what happened once, but what can happen again when the ground beneath our confidence begins to move. So where does this journey leave us? With broken mechanisms, unread scripts, buried temples, desert lines, mountain cities, colossal stones, and stories carried across generations like embers, protected from the wind. Each mystery has offered its own kind of resistance. Not proof that the past was magical, but proof that it was deeper, subtler, and more inventive than our simplified timelines sometimes allow. The ancient world was not waiting for us to make it meaningful. It was already full of meaning, much of which survives only in fragments. What these fragments reveal, above all, is the vulnerability of knowledge. A civilization can observe the heavens, move mountains of stone, map water beneath a desert, and still lose the thread that explains how and why it did those things. Libraries burn, languages fall silent, rituals are interrupted, trade routes collapse, empires rename what they do not fully understand, and yet something persists, a pattern, a tool, a monument, a myth, enough to remind future generations that forgetting is never complete. There is comfort in that, but also responsibility. We often look at ancient mysteries and ask what they say about those who came before us. Just as important is what they say about us now. Which of our own achievements will remain legible in 1,000 years? Which will survive only as scattered components, stripped of context, prompting new theories and careful wonder? We are not separate from the people we study. We are simply another civilization, standing briefly in the light, trusting that our records will hold. Maybe that is the most human lesson of all. Knowledge is not a monument. It is a living chain, passed imperfectly from mind to mind, generation to generation. It requires humility, care, and the courage to admit how much we do not know. The past does not only ask us to solve its puzzles, it asks us to become better ancestors. And so the mysteries remain, not as failures of understanding, but as invitations to look longer, to ask better questions, to meet the silence of history not with arrogance, but with wonder. Because somewhere between what was lost and what can still be learned, we find the truest measure of civilization. Not certainty, but the enduring human desire to remember, to seek, and to begin again.